On the morning of the 7th of March 2026, a private communication was circulated among the senior royal household that arrived without the diplomatic cushioning palace communications typically deploy when delivering news of institutional consequence. There was no preparatory briefing. There was no courtesy call to the relevant parties in advance of its distribution. There was no softening language of the kind that royal communications machinery has refined across centuries of delivering uncomfortable institutional determinations to people with the power and the motivation to push back against them. The document simply arrived in the flat and final language of procedural fact, and what it contained detonated across every royal residence where it landed with the particular force of something that had been decided at a level that rendered response not merely difficult but structurally pointless. Queen Camilla would not be included in the ceremonial planning, the attendance roster, or the processional structure of King William's future coronation. The determination had been authorized. The authorization was final, and the name attached to it was the one name in the British royal family that combined institutional authority, procedural legitimacy, and personal resolve in proportions that made challenge not merely unlikely, but effectively impossible. Princess Anne had spoken, and this time she had not spoken in a corridor. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and keeps you up to date as everything unfolds. And while you're here, let us know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. It's wonderful to see viewers joining us from around the world. To understand the full weight of what that communication represented, one must first understand the nature of the authority Princess Anne deployed in issuing it. This was not a personal objection dressed in institutional language. It was not the opinion of a senior royal leveraging her proximity to the decision-making process to influence an outcome she preferred. It was a formal procedural determination issued under the private estate and ceremonial oversight remit that Anne has held quietly and without public fanfare since the death of Queen Elizabeth II. That remit, never formally disclosed to the public and never intended for public disclosure, grants its holder a specific and consequential authority over the ceremonial architecture of the monarchy's most significant institutional moments. It was established by Elizabeth herself in the final years of her reign, assigned to the one child she trusted without reservation to exercise it with the discipline and the institutional fidelity the role demanded. Anne had held it for years before anyone outside a tightly controlled circle knew it existed. She had exercised it precisely once before the morning of the 7th of March. The occasion on which she had previously exercised it had also involved Camilla. The outcome on that occasion had also been final. The atmosphere inside the relevant royal residences in the hours following the communications circulation was described by those present within them in terms that converge on a single quality: stillness. Not the stillness of shock, though shock was present in certain quarters. The stillness of people who had understood, at some level they had not previously been required to fully confront, that this moment had been approaching and that its arrival, now that it had come, was not something the institution around them was going to revisit. At Clarence House, engagements were cancelled without explanation. Calls went unanswered. The particular machinery of Camilla's public-facing operation, normally maintained with the disciplined efficiency of a team that had spent years navigating difficult institutional weather, went quiet in a way that communicated more clearly than any statement could have done that what had arrived that morning was not a development her team knew how to manage, because it was not a development that could be managed. It could only be absorbed. And the absorbing of it was going to take considerably longer than a single morning. What Camilla had not known, and what the communication made permanently and irreversibly clear, was that the determination it contained had not been made on the morning it was delivered. It had been made 3 weeks earlier, in a private meeting between Princess Anne and Prince William, at which the specific question of Camilla's role in the coronation planning process had been placed on the table with the directness that characterizes every significant decision William has made in the period since his father's coronation clarified for him the full weight of what he is inheriting and what he intends to do with it. Anne had presented her assessment. William had listened with the attention of a man who had been forming his own conclusions in parallel and had arrived, through a different route, at the same destination. The conversation, sources with knowledge of it confirm, did not last long. The alignment between the two of them on the question at hand was not something that required extensive negotiation, because it was not, by the time that meeting occurred, genuinely in dispute. William's response to Anne's formal request for authorization to proceed had been delivered without elaboration and without hesitation. A single word: proceed. 3 weeks later, the communication arrived, and the monarchy that William is building, deliberately and without apology, announced itself to the woman who had spent 2 years assuming she would have a central place within it. The news had not reached Camilla before the document did. That was not an accident. It was a decision made by people who understood that advance notice would have generated exactly the kind of institutional pressure and personal appeal to Charles that the determination had been specifically structured to foreclose. By the time Camilla read what had been decided, it had already been decided in every way that mattered. The authorization existed. The procedural record was established. And the single word William had spoken 3 weeks earlier in a private room at Windsor had become, on the morning of the 7th of March 2026, the institutional foundation of a fact that no amount of subsequent conversation, appeal, or strategic repositioning was going to alter. She would not be part of William's coronation. Anne had made it so, and William had asked her to. There is a particular kind of institutional consequence that does not arrive as punishment, but as accumulation. It does not announce itself with a single decisive event, but builds instead across a series of moments that individually appear survivable and collectively become something else entirely. The formal block that landed at Clarence House on the morning of the 7th of March 2026 was not the product of a single grievance or a personal animosity that had finally exceeded its containment. It was the logical conclusion of a 2-year documented record of institutional overreach that had been observed, noted, and filed by people with both the authority and the patience to wait until the appropriate moment to act on what they had accumulated. Every move Camilla had made in the period following Charles's coronation had contributed a page to that file. By the morning of the 7th of March, the file was closed, and its closing had been authorized by a future king who had read every page. The Scottish cultural strategy was where the overreach first became visible in terms that could not be dismissed as ambition within acceptable boundaries. Camilla's charitable foundation had submitted a formal proposal for a heritage retreat whose geographic coordinates matched with precision that eliminated any possibility of coincidence the boundaries of Little Balmoral Manor. The estate Queen Elizabeth had privately bequeathed to Lady Louise Windsor in a sealed codicil that predated Elizabeth's death by years. The proposal had been developed with architectural renderings, donor backing, and the particular confidence of someone who had concluded that the symbolic territory most powerfully associated with Elizabeth's personal legacy in Scotland was available for cultural rebranding under a new custodian. It was not available. It had never been available. And the discovery that Camilla's office had been treating it as available, had been building philanthropic infrastructure around an assumption of access that the late Queen's own private instructions had already permanently foreclosed, told Anne something about the nature of Camilla's institutional judgment that she had suspected and now had documented evidence to confirm. The assumption of entitlement had not merely extended to territory that was not hers. It had extended to territory that had been specifically and deliberately protected against exactly that kind of assumption by the woman whose legacy Camilla was attempting to colonize. The Crown's compassion exhibition accelerated the file's accumulation with a speed and a visibility that surprised even those who had been watching closely. Announced 29 minutes after Buckingham Palace confirmed the launch of the archival project Anne had built with Lady Louise, positioned at St. George's Hall with the presumption of someone who had decided that one of the monarchy's most sacred ceremonial venues was available for personal legacy construction. The exhibition revealed the strategic logic behind Camilla's repositioning campaign in terms that a royal historian described publicly and without hesitation as a scrapbook of proximity rather than a tribute to service. Anne's six-word response at a naval charity dinner traveled through every royal corridor within hours. The exhibition's collapse followed with the institutional efficiency of something that had been determined before it opened. The Royal Collection Trust removed its banner. Ticket sales were suspended. The palace homepage was updated with the archival project that had displaced it. Each of those steps had required authorization. Anne had provided it, and each of them had been noted inside Clarence House with a growing understanding that the institutional resistance to Camilla's expansion was not incidental friction, but organized opposition with senior royal endorsement. What transformed Anne's long-held concerns into a formal determination to act was a discovery made in the final weeks of February 2026 that represented an overreach so significant, so procedurally presumptuous, that it moved the question of how to respond from the realm of institutional judgment into the realm of institutional necessity. Camilla's team had been conducting preliminary discussions with ceremonial suppliers, venue coordinators, and at least one senior member of the College of Arms about her role in William's coronation. Those discussions had not been authorized by the Coronation Planning Committee. They had not been sanctioned by William's office. They had not been cleared through any of the procedural channels that govern the planning of a coronation with the seriousness and the institutional weight the occasion demands. They had been initiated unilaterally by a team operating on the assumption that Camilla's ceremonial prominence in William's investiture was a settled matter requiring only logistical coordination rather than a question whose answer had not yet been given because the people responsible for giving it had not been asked. William's reaction upon learning of those unauthorized discussions was described by a source with direct knowledge of it in terms that illuminate everything about the kind of king he intends to be. It was not anger. Anger would have been manageable, addressable, capable of resolution through the kind of institutional diplomacy the palace deploys when senior figures come into conflict over questions of protocol and precedent. What William expressed was something quieter and considerably more final. It was the particular cold clarity of a man who had extended every reasonable accommodation available to him, who had observed with patient attention the accumulating record of institutional presumption that the past 2 years had produced, and who had reached with complete certainty the precise boundary beyond which reasonable accommodation became institutional negligence. He contacted Anne the same day. Their conversation lasted 2 hours. Catherine joined for the final 40 minutes. And when it concluded, the three people who collectively represent the settled future of the British monarchy had reached a determination that none of them had any intention of revisiting. Princess Anne delivered the news to King Charles personally. That decision, the choice to tell him face-to-face rather than through the intermediary channels the palace routinely deploys for sensitive institutional communications, was itself a statement. It said that what had been done was serious enough to require the directness of physical presence. It said that Anne respected Charles sufficiently to look him in the eye when she told him that his wife would not be part of the most important ceremonial moment in his son's reign. And it said, with the particular eloquence of things communicated through form rather than content, that the determination was final in a way that a written communication might have invited him to treat as a starting point for negotiation. It was not a starting point. The meeting took place at Buckingham Palace on the morning of the 8th of March. Those with knowledge of what passed between them describe a conversation conducted in the register of two people who love each other as siblings and who understand, with the clarity that only decades of shared institutional experience can produce, that what one of them has done cannot be undone and that the other knows it. Charles did not shout. He did not threaten. He asked 2 questions. Anne answered both. And then a silence descended that one source described as the heaviest in recent royal memory. Charles loved his wife. He also knew his sister, and he knew, in the part of himself that had always understood the monarchy's needs more clearly than its comforts, that Anne had not acted without justification. Camilla's response moved through several distinct phases in the days that followed, and each phase told its own story about a woman processing a development that had dismantled something she had spent years constructing. The first phase was silence. Engagements were cancelled. Her public-facing team went quiet. The carefully maintained machinery of her institutional presence normally operated with the disciplined efficiency of people who had navigated difficult weather before, simply stopped generating output in a way that communicated more clearly than any statement the scale of what had landed. The second phase was private. Tom Parker Bowles was called. The conversation, described by a source with knowledge of its content, was the moment Camilla fully understood not just what had been decided, but what it meant for the architecture of everything she had been building toward. The ceremonial exclusion was not the wound. The wound was the consensus it represented. William had authorized it. Catherine had aligned with it. Edward had endorsed it. And Charles presented with it as a fait accompli by the one person in the family whose institutional authority he could not override without fracturing the succession he had given his life to protect, had absorbed it in silence. That silence was its own answer. The third phase was the attempt at repositioning. Charitable announcements were timed with visible deliberateness. A media appearance was arranged. None of it landed because the people whose response mattered most were not responding. The detail that traveled fastest through royal circles and struck hardest when it arrived required no interpretation. The College of Arms had updated its internal coronation planning register. Every ceremonial role had been assigned. Every processional position had been allocated with the precision that the most important institutional moment of the coming generation demanded. And in the space where Camilla's name might in any previous iteration of this monarchy's ceremonial thinking have appeared, there were two words that made Anne's determination permanently and institutionally legible to everyone with access to the document. Position unassigned, not reassigned, not under review, not pending further consultation, unassigned. The distinction was deliberate, and its deliberateness was understood by every person who read it as exactly the institutional statement it was intended to be. The door had not been left open. It had been documented as closed in the permanent record of the most important ceremonial planning process of the decade. And the documentation meant that whatever conversations might occur in whatever rooms between now and the coronation itself, the record would always say the same thing. Position unassigned. Anne had not merely blocked Camilla from a ceremony, she had written the block into the institutional architecture of the monarchy's future, and the architecture, once written, does not revise itself for sentiment. There is a version of this story that frames what happened on the morning of the 7th of March 2026 as a personal defeat. A powerful woman outmaneuvered by a more powerful one. A carefully constructed ambition dismantled by an institutional authority she had underestimated, and a future king she had misread. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because what Anne's determination actually represents, stripped of its personal dimensions and examined for what it reveals about the monarchy being assembled around William with increasing deliberateness and increasing speed, is something considerably more significant than one woman blocking another from a ceremony. It is the clearest signal yet that the monarchy William is inheriting is not the monarchy he was born into, and that the distance between those two things has been traveled quietly and without announcement by a group of people who understood before the public did that the institution's survival in the coming generation would depend entirely on its willingness to make exactly the kinds of decisions that comfort and sentiment and the accumulated weight of personal loyalty would always counsel against making. William's coronation vision has been taking shape in the private committees and ceremonial planning sessions that the palace has not briefed journalists on, and does not intend to brief journalists on until the moment requires it. What has emerged from those sessions, described by sources with access to their broad outlines, is a vision that departs from the pageantry-heavy ceremonial tradition of previous investitures in ways that are deliberate, considered, and reflective of a man who has thought seriously about what his coronation must communicate to a generation that will not extend deference simply because deference has historically been extended. The emphasis is on Commonwealth relevance. on historical accountability. On a leaner and more purposeful public ceremony that serves the people observing it rather than the institution performing it. The guest and participant roster being assembled reflects this vision in every detail. Every name on it is there because of what they represent to the monarchy's future. Every name absent from it is absent for the same reason. Catherine's position at the center of this planning process is not incidental. It is foundational. Her relationship with Anne, built across years of shared and deeply considered understanding of what the monarchy must become to survive the scrutiny of a generation that will inherit it with open eyes, has given the coronation planning a coherence and a forward momentum that reflects two women who have arrived, through different routes and different experiences, at the same essential conclusion. The monarchy's greatest threat has never been external. It has always been the accumulated weight of its own appetite for self-perpetuation at the expense of self-renewal. What Anne and Catherine are building around William is a coronation that renews, and the decisions about who is present and who is not present within it are inseparable from that renewal's integrity. Camilla will attend. That has not been placed in question by anyone involved in these decisions, and it would be both inaccurate and unfair to suggest otherwise. She will be seated with the dignity appropriate to the widow of a king. She will be acknowledged with the respect the institution extends to those who have occupied its highest formal positions. She will be present at the moment the crown passes to the next generation with the visibility her history within the family warrants. What she will not be is central. She will not shape the ceremony. She will not occupy a processional position that implies an ongoing institutional authority she no longer holds. She will witness the future without being permitted to define it. And that distinction between witnessing and defining, between presence and centrality, between the respect owed to the past and the authority reserved for the future, is the distinction that Anne's determination on the morning of the 7th of March made permanent and institutional and beyond the reach of any subsequent appeal. Anne has not spoken publicly about any of this. She has continued, as she has always continued, to work. The crown endures because people like Anne make it endure, not through performance, not through carefully managed visibility, but through the particular discipline of someone who has always understood that the institution's greatest asset is not its ceremony. It is the unshakable willingness of the people who serve it to make the hard decisions that its survival requires, without asking for credit, without seeking applause, and without once mistaking the weight of the crown for the glamour of wearing it. William knows it. Catherine knows it. And on the morning of the 7th of March 2026, in the flat and final language of a procedural communication that arrived without warning and without appeal, the monarchy's future announced itself, quietly, deliberately, and without the slightest interest in how it would be received.